Members, this is the appointed time and we have a quorum. Welcome to the meeting of the panel on information technology and broadcasting. First item on the agenda, information papers issued since the meeting on the 9th of December 2024. We had a discussion with the ITIB and the CEDB on the 7th of February in relation to the work plan for this panel this year. Now, our plan is set up to June this year, so we've asked the administration to shuffle the items so that those proposed to be discussed in Q3 and Q4 can be moved forward to the first 2 quarters. So in light of our request, the administration will be shuffling the items, especially that a new item relating to spectrum planning for the development of low-altitude economy will be included. We'd also like to put in more items on the list, so members, please note that if we include more items, we may need to extend our meeting time. The administration has issued 3 papers since the last meeting. Please note these 3 items on the agenda, and please may I draw your attention to a letter from Mr. Holden CHOW dated the 27th of January this year requesting a discussion on regulation of person-to-person telemarketing calls. And after the administration has given a written response, we will consider whether to have a further discussion and put that item onto our list. And then next items for discussion at the next meeting. The next meeting is scheduled for the 17th of March 2025. It's a Monday. Now this meeting will start at 4:30 p.m. We've changed the meeting date. Now, as mentioned earlier, originally we would be discussing the work progress of the cyberport, but then, depending on how the items are shuffled, please wait for the announcement of the new agenda, as well as the work plan for this legislative session. Any views? If not, we move on to the next item, proposed arrangements of the subsidy scheme to extend 5G coverage in rural and remote areas. Let me welcome the administration to our meeting. Members, if you want to speak, please press the button now. Let me welcome Undersecretary for Commerce and Economic Development, Dr. Bernard Chan, and his team. Members, a reminder, if you have direct or indirect pecuniary interest in relation to the item being discussed, please disclose the nature of the interest before you speak in accordance with Rule 83A of the Rules of Procedure. Please also note the voting requirement where direct pecuniary interests are involved, according to Rule 84. This is a funding item to take forward the subsidy scheme. The government has proposed a new commitment of $154 million. And starting from 2025-26, in the 5-year financial period, the government will be applying for funding for the subsidy scheme. Members, at the end of our discussion, after you've made your point, please also state whether you support the funding proposal. I'll give the floor to Undersecretary. Madam Chair, members, good afternoon. At the beginning of this new year, let me wish everybody prosperity and good health and smooth sailing. I'd like to join my team in reporting to members 2 measures in relation to expanding our coverage, our mobile network coverage. In the first item, we will discuss the subsidy scheme to extend 5G coverage in rural and remote areas. The 2023 policy address announced that the government will expedite the expansion of mobile network infrastructure in rural and remote areas through subsidies in order to enhance communication network coverage. Now, at the policy briefing in October last year, we reported the progress to the panel. We garnered support from members, and we then consulted the sector. According to the OFCA's statistics, the coverage in rural areas and country parks are up to 80%, and we plan to subsidize MNOs, mobile network operators, to build 50 radio base stations in different districts, such as North District, Haipo, Saikou, Sha Tin, Islands District, Southern District, Chunwan, etc., etc. Depending on the complexity of works involved, each RBS installation will get 2 million, up to 2 million of subsidy. And for more complex works, the additional funding will amount to 4 million. So altogether, the total commitment is $154 million. The subsidy scheme will be divided into 4 phases, and upon commissioning of all the radio base stations, the total coverage will be extended to 90% for country parks, and for major hiking trails, the coverage can be increased to 98% and above. The new RBS radio base stations will cover about 70 villages, benefiting about 20,000 villages. The CDB and OFCA earlier consulted the relevant district councils, rural area committees, and also other local sector representatives on the proposed framework, and we received general support. We once again thank everyone for their invaluable input and their support for the proposed injection. We hope that this funding application can be passed by electrical as soon as possible, so as to enhance the network coverage for rural residents. I will now give the floor to OFCA representative to give you a more detailed presentation with the help of a PowerPoint, and then we'll be happy to take questions from members. Mr. Ng from OFCA. Thank you. Now, I'll now take the floor to give you more details about the subsidy scheme. The Undersecretary mentioned that the 2023 policy address announced that the government would expedite the expansion of mobile network infrastructure in rural and remote areas through subsidies in order to enhance the mobile communications network coverage, as well as quality of life in these areas, and safeguarding the safety of rural activities. After the announcement of the initiative in the policy address, the CDB and OFCA have been actively preparing for the launch. In July, August last year, we also consulted the mobile network operators, or MNOs, before finalizing the implementation details. I'll go through the proposed arrangements. OFCA will be the implementation agency. It will be responsible for handling and approving applications. It will also monitor installation of radio base stations, as well as coordinate MNOs and other government departments, such as LCSD, FEHD, and AFCD, regarding the installation of radio base stations. Initially, we've identified approximately 50 sites. Across 10 districts, including North District, Saikou, Taipo, Sha Tin, Yuen Long, Tuen Mun, Chunwan, Southern, Eastern Islands districts. How about projecting this slide full screen? Sorry. To expedite the implementation of the scheme, we have identified premises with basic power infrastructure and space for RBS installation. These are mostly government buildings. I come to the amount of subsidy. We impose a cap of subsidy at $2 million per RBS. For those involving complex works, an additional subsidy of up to $2 million will be provided. That means the cap for the entire project is 4 million Hong Kong dollars. The subsidy will be granted on a reimbursement basis. That means applications will be considered and approved by the OFCA before the subsidy is disbursed. As for eligibility, all licensed MNOs in Hong Kong are eligible to take part in the scheme. We have 4 MNOs in Hong Kong, and all these licensees are eligible under the subsidy scheme. In order to make the facilities and services available to the wider public, we will require the applicant MNOs to abide by the shared use principle by allowing other MNOs to install their facilities at the same location. The applications will be processed on a first-come, first-served basis. For applications involving sites that are more technically ready, sites with pressing needs, and sites with more participating MNOs, priority will be accorded. The subsidy scheme requires the provision of 5G services. In other words, MNOs are required to provide the minimum or services with a minimum average download speed of not less than 100 megabytes per second. Upon funding approval by LegCo, we will begin to receive applications. Then works will begin. After works have been completed, they will be required to provide the necessary documentation to show that they're able to provide stable and quality services before disbursement of subsidy takes place. Now we have this timetable. For the first phase, 30 RBS stations will be installed at different locations. So for phase 1, they will be completed first. For phase 2, there are 20 sites remaining, and they will be completed within the 2-year period. Our goal is to complete the installation of all RBSs within 4 years after the start of the scheme, and that for the RBSs in phase 1, they should be completed in the 12 months after applications have been approved. As mentioned by Undersecretary, the subsidy cap per RBS is $2 million. For more complex works, the project could receive a subsidy of up to $4 million, and the subsidy will be dispersed on a reimbursement basis. The total commitment is around $154 million. We anticipate that the mobile network coverage of country parks will be enhanced and that quality 5G services can be provided. Every month, over 1 million visitors go to country parks in Hong Kong. It is our goal that these visitors can enjoy quality 5G services in the countryside. As for villages, about 70 villages will be covered, benefiting around 20,000 villages. We have a monitoring mechanism in place. At the time of application, MNOs will be required to submit the construction plan and schedule for the radio base station. The application guidelines will clearly set out the obligations of MNOs in relation to the radio base stations. The MNOs will also need to sign an undertaking at the time of application to make sure that they will meet all the terms and conditions. After the applications have been approved, we'll monitor the progress of RBS installation. We will also require them to submit progress reports. Service acceptance checking will also be performed upon completion of works, and only when we are satisfied will we disperse the subsidy. In order to protect public coffers, we will require the MNOs to provide services on a continuous basis. Say after installation of RBS and after disbursement of subsidy, if the MNO is unable to provide the services so required, then we will request the return of the subsidy to the government. The application guidelines will also clearly set out the obligations of MNOs as well as the detailed procedures.
The subsidy scheme will cover rural and remote areas. We will be building RBSs there, so we have to be mindful on the environmental impact. Could you pick up the speed because we are almost out of time? So OFCA will require these operators to follow environmental regulations. This is to minimize the impact of the works on the residents nearby and the public. As operators build the RBSs, we will require them to adopt proper designs so that the appearances can blend in with the surrounding environment. Where possible, operators should minimize the building bulk. On radiation safety, OFCA has a mechanism in place to ensure the safety of the RBSs. And we also require that the operators follow the standards, meaning the safety standards of the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection. Once the RBSs are operational, OFCA will assess the operation. The operators will have to submit reports based on the operation. OFCA will also be testing the approved RBSs for their radiation levels. More than 13,500 random measurements were done. So far, all the results show they were within safety limits. Last December and in January this year, we consulted the industry on this proposal. We also consulted the relevant district councils, rural committees, and local representatives. They welcomed the proposal. If this proposal has member support, we will follow the established procedure to seek funding approval from LegCo. After the funding is approved, we would work to launch this subsidy scheme as soon as we can within this year. That's all from me. Members, we have to clear out by 4:30 p.m. this afternoon for the next meeting, so we have to be mindful of the time. 12 members are waiting to speak. Professor Chow Ho-ding, Mr. Ben Ronnick Chen, Mr. Jenny Lee, Mr. Lam Chen Sing, Mr. Ma Feng-kuo, Mr. Chen Xiu-hong, Mr. Tony Tse, Professor William Wong, Mr. Tang Fei, Mr. Dennis Leung, Ms. Eunice Xiong, followed by me. Let's do 3 minutes each member. Please be brief. Professor Chow Ho-ding. Thank you, Madam Chair. This is great for people. This subsidy scheme is good. But we're only covering 50 locations. How much area can we cover for each RBS? Most RBSs are at public toilets. Is it about public power supply that you're putting the RBS at public toilets? There are signal dead zones where you don't even have a public toilet. What do we do about them? And you can only have one operator per RBS. Is that how it works? Hong Kong has 4 to 5 such operators. So will that constrain the effectiveness of whatever RBS we have? Undersecretary. Each RBS can cover several hundred square meters to 3 square kilometers. In a country park, you may have reservoirs or dams. There are also trees blocking the signal. In those cases, the coverage will be more limited. On Professor Chow's second question, The member is right. As we consider RBSs, we have to consider technical factors such as power supply and loading requirements and fiber connections. The member is right. Many government premises meet these requirements in terms of the technical requirements, so we will start by building on government premises to speed things up. On the third question, we have identified 50 locations. We want to have at least one operator for each location. At many locations, several operators will be building RBSs there. We have been coordinating the effort, so we will do our best to ensure enough operators get involved in the scheme. Madam Chair, one more comment. The Undersecretary said each RBS can cover several hundred square meters to a few square kilometers. Can we have a device to amplify the coverage? Otherwise, the money won't do any good. Can we step up the devices, Undersecretary? We can go for stronger frequencies for certain RBSs that can travel further. So that's something operators can consider, such as stepping up capacity or using different frequency bands. Mr. Ronick Chen. Thank you, Madam Chair. This is a funding proposal, so I want to focus on the price tag. For normal project, $2 million. Complex works, $4 million. So in ordinary cases, how much does it cost to build an RBS? So my question is, how much will our subsidy make up? What's the percentage of the subsidy as a share of the cost? 31 of these locations are public toilets. And then operators can go for an alternative location if it's technically impossible to build in a certain place. So when can an operator choose an alternative site instead? The subsidy caps are $2 and $4 million respectively. So the line is drawn where a complex work is involved. So how do we decide what's a complex project? For ordinary cases, up to $2 million. For more complex works, up to $4 million. Where do we draw the line? How do we draw the line? Undersecretary. Now, for a relatively uncomplicated project, $2 million, we can cover roughly half the cost. On the technical side of things, for more complicated cases, a location further away from the fiber networks, we may need excavation to lay the optic fibers, or a location may lack power supply. In those cases, more works are needed. These are more complicated works. So for phase 1, 20 locations, these locations meet our requirements in terms of having internet access or power supply. So those are straightforward. But then you also have the more complicated ones. OFCR requires operators to submit a report setting out their plan, what solutions the operator has in mind in terms of the power supply, internet, fiber, and loading, and then we will provide the subsidy on a reimbursement basis. So my question is, For $2 million, that's around half the cost. But what about the $4 million cap? What's the share you're making up? It's also roughly half the cost. So do you support the scheme, Mr. Chen? Yes, I do. Mr. Stanley Lee. Madam Chair, I'm not a member of this panel, so I cannot express whether I support the scheme. But personally, I do support the scheme. My colleagues at the district level and Madam Chair yourself have been campaigning for 5G network in rural areas. The technology matters for rural residents. These people have paid for the services, but they can only access the service when they're in the urban areas. Now, the subsidy cap for project is $2 million, and the estimate is that it costs $4 million per RBS. So the government covers half the cost, but has the government assessed how attractive the subsidy scheme is? My worry is that operators won't find the subsidy scheme attractive. Do we have any key performance indicators about how many RBSs we will be building? Now, for Southeast New Territories, Sai Kung, Ma On Shan, and Cheung Kwan O, there are rural areas. I wonder if the locations in the annex can cover those locations in Southeast New Territories. I checked with the rural committee chairman of those places, such as Hang Hao. Now, there are places Tai Lang, Wong, Ao Niu, Kai Hang, Tai Mong Zai, Wong Mo Ying, Yan Yi Road, Ma On Shan Village, and Ngong Ping. Can I get a response maybe after the meeting to see if those rural areas will be covered under Phase 1 or Phase 2 of the subsidy scheme? Because this matter is top of mind for those rural committee chairmen. Now, my question is this. We need this subsidy scheme for operators to provide 5G services. Now, for Area 137 in Cheung Kwan O, can we lay down the network, lay down the infrastructure in advance? The government will have to build the infrastructure there anyway. So can we get the government to actually build the infrastructure first instead of waiting for the operators to provide the 5G network? Would that be saving us money instead? Undersecretary. We have done a lot of work in picking the 50 locations. At least one operator has signed up for each location, and in fact for 30 or so locations, multiple operators have signed up. I'm not worried about the lack of involvement of operators. Now, in terms of the KPI, we will cover the 50 locations in the next 4 years. Those RBSs will be built and they will be put into service. As for the locations, we will have to check whether the RBSs cover the rural locations mentioned by Mr. Lee. In general terms, rural areas where operators lack an financial incentive to cover are generally covered by our scheme, but we can check whether Mr. Lee's locations mentioned by Mr. Lee will be covered. Now, on stepping up 5G coverage, we amended the telecommunications ordinance last year. The change meant that on new buildings and redeveloped buildings, we have to reserve space for building 5G structures. That means new buildings will be able to provide better 5G coverage. Mr. Lam Chen Sing. Thank you, Madam Chair. I support the broad directions of the scheme. We want to get more operators involved. But does the subsidy cap make sense? We heard that the subsidy will make up half the construction cost. These operators involved are big business. They have the means. They're supposed to fulfill their social responsibility. These operators shouldn't just shy away from work just because it's not very profitable. Bus operators, for example, they are profitable despite running losses for specific routes. So my question is, are we saying that if we offer less subsidy, operators won't sign up? Or can we simply get the operators to pay more towards the cost of building the RBSs? The paper says in 4 years' time, the RBSs will be operational. Can we move faster? Can we have the RBSs operational sooner? OFCA will be coordinating the work, whereas individual departments will be approving the applications. Can OFCA get the departments to move faster? Individual departments may take their time. Do we have enough people at those departments to approve the applications? Can we have a high-level conversation between OFCA and the department so that we move faster with the scheme?
Undersecretary, let me take this question. To answer part one to the question, as I mentioned just now, we've been discussing with the mobile network operators. We find the level of subsidy appropriate. As I answered other members' questions, the amount of subsidy should cover roughly half the cost of installation. And to answer the second question, we have two phases. We have phase 1 and phase 2 because we want to go ahead with the technically ready ones first. For the ones in phase 1, a year after the rollout of the scheme, some 30%, that means a dozen RBSs will have been installed. And meanwhile, OFCA will coordinate with different government departments and MNOs. We've been making a lot of preparations, as mentioned by the member. In terms of, preparing documentation and approving the works plans, etc., our government departments have been making preparations. So you support that as well, Mr. Lam? Yes, Mr. Ma Fung Kwok. I do hope that the mobile network can be accessed by more villagers or visitors. So I fully support the telecommunications proposal. But who should foot the bill? Now, of course, when it comes to telecommunications as a piece of infrastructure, the government has the primary responsibility. And of course, as such, the works are carried out by MNOs, and it is unreasonable that the MNOs are only willing to take forward the installation with government subsidy. The other point is efficiency. If you go to the mainland and if you travel by train or if you ride in a car on the highway, you will see that tall steel towers are erected at intervals. I don't know whether the government foots the bill or otherwise, but at least these are shared facilities. Now, if there are 4 MNOs and if only one of them applies for the subsidy, does it mean that only one MNO will lay the cable for sharing among the 4 MNOs? What about power supply? Will the applicant be required to approach the power companies for the laying of cables and for sharing among the MNOs or not? Well, these are the specific arrangements. I am just of the view that this is somewhat unreasonable. We can't have the government step in every time for everything. It is unreasonable that if it's not a profitable business, then the government must provide a subsidy. Can we require the MNOs to provide the necessary services? We should adopt a new mindset because I don't think the government is showing enough resolve. You should not be so accommodating. You should take a more hardball approach. Let's say we're just talking about $300 million if you double it up. So I hope that you can make it a licensing condition. Undersecretary. We have a free and open telecommunications market in Hong Kong. We adopt a market-led approach. MNOs give consideration to the actual circumstances as well as other commercial considerations in expanding the network. No, but my point is, why don't you make it mandatory for the MNOs to build a network? But that won't be a market-led approach. That will become an executive-led approach, and the government will be intervening with the market, and that will not be the best for our economy. If you take a look at the international practices in terms of affordability and connectivity, Hong Kong tops the chart. And that's exactly because we take a market-led approach. But of course, I agree with Mr. Ma that there are pain points to be solved. Our government is proactive. We identify the problems and we discuss with the MNOs. When it comes to the countryside and rural areas, financial incentives must be provided for MNOs to help solve the problem. And that is why, as I mentioned, we had a subsidy scheme to extend the fiber-based networks to villages and rural areas. And now we also have a subsidy scheme for mobile network to cover country parks and rural areas with a view to expanding the 5G network coverage. Can I have another go? I don't really agree with what Undersecretary said. I'll just let you say a few words. We won't allow for a second round. My point is, you can impose additional conditions. It won't be market intervention. We still provide a level playing field for everybody, for all bidders. This is not interfering with the market. The other point is, these operators are required to provide services. The government is also responsible. You can't put up the excuse of having a free and open market. The MNOs will only build stations with government subsidy. This is unreasonable. Hong Kong is a very small place. It only spans 1,000 square kilometers. I think your point is noted. Next, Mr. Chan Siu-Hong. Thank you, Chair. Let me reassure Mr. Ma that I will pick up on his point, and in fact, other members have expressed the same. Let me just say at the outset that in relation to the subsidy scheme to extend the 5G coverage in rural remote areas, in principle, I support the funding proposal, but I do have something to say. Like what other members have said, even with the free and open telecommunications market, there are ways to go by it, and the government's role is to ensure that those profit-making MNOs will undertake to expand coverage in rural areas, even if these spots may not be the money-making ones. At the moment, the problem is that there is no conditions. There is no condition in the license to compel them to do so. So for existing licensees, at the moment, it is unfair to all of a sudden impose licensing conditions to them. My question is this. Your proposal is to have 30 sites and then 20 sites, altogether 50 RBSs. And if each RBS is provided with a $2 million subsidy, does it work commercially for the MNOs? Because if we consider the margin for those in active investment, I don't think the figures look good to them. So I'd like to know whether they were able to complete the installation as requested. Now, these 50 sites, even upon completion, will only boost coverage to some 90% in the rural areas, not 100%. So I want to know whether there is any backup plan. The other point is, I think that this is dragging on for so long. Like the Undersecretary said, it won't be completed until 4 years later. I want to know, for example, whether you could speed up the process by, say, building some steel towers and having some add-on components. It's not really difficult. Do you have a timetable? Can you tell us with confidence that for the RBSs in phase 1 you can complete all of them in 12 months? I can tell you that we'll be able to complete at least 15 within the first year. Now, you also ask about some towers being built. As mentioned in the paper, there are sites where complex works are involved, such as telecom or transmission stations or transmission towers. We may need to extend the fiber network and power cables to the towers, and it will be more complex than installing radio base stations at existing buildings. But anyway, we will consider the ways in which we can speed things up and enhance our efficiency. To answer the next point, as I said to other members just now, in fact, in recent years we have introduced various licensing conditions. For example, even for incumbent licensees, they are required to, say, provide services within the licensing period, and they are also required to pay, say, the bond, performance bond. Last year, we amended the telecommunications ordinance to make sure that space will be reserved in newly built structure for the purpose of installing RBSs. And that for spots with poor coverage within buildings, such as car parks, lifts, etc., more radio base stations should be built. That's our request on MNOs, and we will consider member suggestions and consider adding conditions to the licenses. Mr. Tony J. Thank you, Madam Chair. I would urge the Undersecretary to consider what Mr. Ma said. Now, if it is the government's policy to achieve 100% coverage for everybody in Hong Kong, then I don't think the subsidy scheme is effective. At the end, it would only benefit the MNOs. Now, I want to know about the subsidy cap of $2 million. For complex works, the cap could go up to $4 million. As I understand, for some stations, the construction cost may not be as high. Now, would you like to clarify that you are not taking a matching fund approach? And I'd also like to know what is meant by complex works. It could be explained away very easily. I'd like to have more details from you. And the next point is about shared use. Say, if I fork out money as an MNO to build this facility, then in what way am I required to let other MNOs use the facility? Will there be any government intervention? Because if it's up to me, of course, I'd like to dominate the market as much as possible. Why would I allow my competitor to use it? And what about maintenance? Under shared use principle, how is it made out? How do you make sure that everything would be fair. And then paragraph 16, according to this paragraph, upon completion of works, the network coverage will be enhanced to at least 90%, and coverage along major government hiking trails will exceed 98%. So that's close to 100%. Why aren't the geopark and marine parks covered?
For the geopark, there are a few RBSs, so the geopark is covered. But you're not covering the park in terms of your figure. We're saying with all the RBSs in place, the coverage rate will go up. That will cover all the 50 locations. We're factoring in all those 50 locations. On shared use, the RBSs built by one operator will need to be shared with other operators, and that's what each operator has to pledge when they build an RBS as part of the terms. On the licensing conditions, we have to consider the mainland's and overseas experience. We have a market-based system. This means we will consider members' views where appropriate. I want to clarify the point about the subsidy cap. So we provide the subsidy on a reimbursement basis. So if a project costs less than $2 million, we won't pay the full $2 million. But based on your current analysis, you will cover half the cost. Now, for straightforward project, the cost will be roughly $4 million. So the $2 million subsidy can cover half the cost. When you have to provide the fiber-based network and you have to arrange power supply or change the loading structure, that counts as civil works, and that's where most of the cost will come from. In the end, we provide the subsidy on a reimbursement basis based on the actual expenditure. Professor William Wong. My question is the same as that raised by Mr. Ma Fengkuok. The government should provide more services for the people. The market-based system may not be the best system for this scenario. So I support the idea of making building RBSs a condition of licensees. We didn't put that in the licensing conditions in the past, so we can only ask operators to build RBSs with subsidies. Our upcoming item will be about the auctioning of spectrum bands. So can I invite the government to incorporate our ideas into the auctioning of spectrum bands? Undersecretary. As I said, we consider the experience and the practice of the mainland market and overseas. On the point about auctioning spectrum bands, we have to consider the history of demand and supply. We also note members' comments. Where feasible, we will incorporate their views into our work. Mr. Tony Tse and Professor William Wong, do you support this funding proposal? We support it. Professor William Wong. Mr. Tang Fei. I support the funding scheme. For remote areas, there may be many people or few people living there, but there are hikers. So network coverage will be a net positive. Many tourists also visit our country parks and hiking trails. From Xiaohongshu, tourists grumble about the lack of network coverage in those rural locations. So here's a question. Many RBSs will be at public toilets. The point is to have a building there so that you have an easier time installing the RBS. But let's look at phase 2, number 51, Tai Long Wan on Lantau Island. I wonder if we don't have any government buildings there, do we just put an RBS in the middle of nowhere in Tai Long Wan? Public toilets require frequent cleaning, and there are cleaners involved. My question is, you put the RBS at the public toilet, you will need to issue guidelines to our cleaners. Otherwise, the cleaners may accidentally damage the RBS. There are all kinds of wires and power cords. We don't want any damage to the RBS. Once the system is damaged accidentally, you will have to worry about maintenance. So how do we get the maintenance right? That's something to bear in mind. Now, I also have a suggestion. It's about the funding. Now, for more challenging works, a higher subsidy limit will apply. The coverage will be a few hundred square meters to a few square kilometers, depending on the location. So, my suggestion is, when the proposal reaches the Finance Committee, can the government spell out whether each project belongs to a straightforward project or a complicated project? And can we also get a sense of the coverage of each RBS if this proposal reaches the Finance Committee? Undersecretary. For each project, we require a detailed proposal from operators. Operators will have to tell us the network coverage and also how they arrive at the coverage. As I said, the coverage may be a few hundred square meters to a few square kilometers. We will provide the figures. I agree with the member about the impact on the surrounding environment and the location in Tai Long Wan. We will see if there are buildings already in the location. That's why the Tai Long Wan project comes towards the end of phase 2. That belongs to the more complicated cases where land grants may be involved. For phase 1, the projects are straightforward, so they fall within the $2 million category. So we are confident about being able to build 15 RBSs under phase 1. Those are straightforward projects. Mr. Dennis Leung. Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like some further details about the number of users for each of the 4 network operators and their annual profits. The government is looking for $145 million for this commitment. If those operators are making a profit, how come they cannot pay for these RBSs? Why not look at the profit levels of the operators, and can we get the information on their profits? Now I'm looking at one of the RBSs in Saiwan. Around Saiwan, there's a hiking trail. The coverage is green. Why build another RBS at the public toilet? I'm looking at the RBSs. If the smaller ones offer a coverage of 200 square meters, and for the large coverage RBSs, they can cover as wide as 8 to 9 square kilometers. So what kind of RBSs are we expecting our MNOs to build? We need more details. You want to cover 70 villages, 20,000 villagers will be able to benefit. So for these 54 RBSs, how many villagers does each project cover? How many people will benefit from each RBS? I don't see those details in the paper, Undersecretary. For the Taiwan project, certain operators are working on 5G coverage, but not all MNOs are involved. So right now, the coverage there leaves much to be desired. So we're trying to enhance the network coverage in Taiwan. Now for the MNOs involved, they are all listed companies. Their profit numbers are public information. It's a market-based system. Operators have their respective strategies when it comes to plans for their 5G network. They make changes and they decide on where to build RBSs. They tend to choose more crowded places when they want to build RBSs. That's why we want incentives for these operators to build RBSs where there are fewer people. As with spectrum bands and building RBSs, we have to go through tendering. If our terms deviate too much from the current system, then I'm worried that we may affect the tendering process. We have to bear in mind coverage and affordability. Out of more than 200 economies in the world, we are the first place and second place in terms of our telecom service coverage. It's thanks to our long-standing policy that our operators have been able to offer a variety of choices to our people. But I note the members' comment, so we will see how to achieve the best outcome. Mr. Denslow. I'm looking for further details from the government, so the number of villagers who will benefit and how many villagers will cover from each project. Now, the paper shows you the aggregate figure. For individual project, each operator has to submit a detailed proposal when they apply for a particular location. They will provide the details, so we will be able to share those details. Mr. Leung also asked about devices. We will provide figures on them. Mr. Leung, do you support the scheme? Yes, I do. Ms. Eunice Young. I support the funding proposal. The coverage in country parks is 80%, for hiking trails 95%. The proposal is to build 50 RBSs at different locations in remote areas. Most such locations are at public toilets. The government stressed the market-based system. In those rural areas, operators don't think those locations are profitable, so that's why we need subsidies. The government wants to provide the subsidy on a reimbursement basis. But then there are needs in rural areas, works where you don't have the power supply will be more complicated, and hence the higher subsidy limit we get it. And then we also have to go through tendering. The RBSs have to be shared between different operators. We get it too. These are unattractive proposals. You still have to build it, so we need government subsidies. But then you take a first come, first served approach. Some locations will be tricky. You have to leave some to phase 2. So should we offer even more subsidies for trickier locations so that operators build faster? You need 4 years to build 50 RBSs. But let's bear in mind people's needs. There's keen demand for network coverage. 50 RBSs in 4 years. Will we achieve full coverage with all these 50 locations? I don't see that reflected in the paper. So with all these RBSs, when we go to a country park or a hiking trail, what's the coverage level we can expect? And what next after these 50 RBSs? Our internet access speed is lower than that in the mainland. That's because of a shortage of RBSs. With these 50 RBSs, will we simply get coverage without speed? The minimum download speed is 100 Mbps. That's a rather low bar. How can we increase the speed and also increase coverage at the same time? Can I first get a response about the coverage? What kind of coverage can we expect afterwards?
For country parks, the coverage will go up from 80 to 90%. For major government hiking trails, it will go up to over 98%. So that's on coverage. For more complex locations, as mentioned by the member, the cost would be about $8 million, covering some civil engineering works and subject to other conditions such as power supply, optic fiber network, load restrictions. So that's about $8 million, and we have in fact invited the MNOs to go on site visits. For phase 1, not requiring a lot of complex works, they should be completed in a year's time. So we'll continue to coordinate and liaise with different parties, including the MNOs, the relevant government departments. The OFCA will also take up the role as a coordinator to ensure that the proper documentation can be submitted. Do you support this proposal, Ms. Eunice Yung? Yes, Mr. Chan Hok-pong. I support the funding proposal, but I'd like to share a story with you. Earlier, I visited Sap Long in Lantau, and this village representative told me this situation. An elderly was rather ill at home, and the family member wanted to make a call, but there was no signal at home. It took 10 minutes on foot for this family member to dial 999 when there was finally a signal. But this family member was ill. The elderly person was ill. The family member did not stay at the spot. So for these villages in rural areas, the mobile network represents more than just entertainment. It's a lifeline for them. Now, on the premise of having 90% network coverage, in general, some rural residents are still living in the third world, so to speak, and it is unacceptable. So I support the subsidy scheme. We need to give an incentive to the MNOs to fix the problem. There may only be a few households in the rural spots, but after all, the network coverage is a necessity. My question is whether this subsidy scheme could meet the government's objective. Now, if this is not, after all, a profitable business and MNOs are deterred to complete the network there, then even with a subsidy, you're only funding half of the cost of installation. It still remains not a profitable business, and they may not be interested in building the stations. So I do have doubts as to whether the MNOs will be actively applying for the subsidy. And what is Plan B if there is no MNO interested in the subsidy? My next question is, you need to put the residents' living needs first, because for them the network is a necessity. Say for Sablong in Lantau, is it possible to move this project from phase 2 to phase 1 so as to safeguard and meet the living needs of rural residents? Undersecretary. Yes, I agree with Mr. Chan. In terms of according priority, we will have regard to the pressing needs of an RBS there. If by installing an RBS we're able to substantially improve the quality of living of residents there, we will definitely give it a thought. So we will go back and review the spots you mentioned and see whether it's possible to advance the works or whether there are other technical considerations. Now, about what you said, in fact, we have a number of ongoing initiatives, including the HKSOS, which is a mobile app launched by the police. Despite inclement weather or poor signal, the user could still send an SOS signal to the 999 report center, and that the precise location can be identified. If you call 112 likewise, with one of the MNO signal, you will be able to connect to the police. To answer the member's question, all 50 sites will be undertaken by the relevant MNOs. So let me reassure members, Mr. Chan Kim Po, I support the funding proposal, but I have some questions. We discussed at length the amount of subsidy. Let's say if it costs $1 million, then the subsidy will fully cover the cost. And that's also the case for $2 million. I don't understand if it goes beyond $2 million. What's the benefit for that MNO to build that station? Well, perhaps under the shared use principle, this MNO will be able to charge other competitors for using the station. Is that true? As I said, we invited the MNOs to go on visits. For those not requiring additional civil engineering works or complex procedures, the cost of an RBS would be close to $4 million. So basically, the subsidy in general would only cover half the cost. For more complex works, the cost could be as high as $8 million. Yes, so what is the point of installing the RBS even with a subsidy if they're unable to get a profit? Of course, for some locations, they may not be financially attractive comparing to other spots in the city areas. But then we're talking about some new development areas, and that in the long run, the MNOs may be able to attract more customers. And in that sense, they may find the scheme attractive. And as I mentioned, the 50 sites have been undertaken by the MNOs. Now, is it possible that one MNO undertakes, say, 10 RBSs so as to achieve economy of scale? Well, it's up to the MNOs to decide which sites they would like to work on. So they need to have regard to their business plan. They may focus on, say, a country park in a particular district. But as I said, out of the 50 sites, there are some 30 sites which have been undertaken by more than one MNO. So we're confident. Now, say if one MNO is familiar with a particular spot or station, is it possible that they choose that particular site? As I said, if some unforeseeable circumstances emerge, because, like I said, if some sites involve complex civil engineering works, which would render the site or the installation non-feasible, then they could come up with alternative sites if necessary. And we will also carefully consider the proposals before giving the subsidy on a reimbursement basis. Right, I'm the last to speak. We have country parks, hiking trails, and other villages with poor mobile network coverage. The government has actively rolled out the subsidy scheme, so I support it. I understand upon completion for government hiking trails, the coverage will go up to 98%, and that for villages, 70 villages will be covered, benefiting some 20,000 residents. But we have hundreds of villages in Hong Kong. Now, for the subsidy scheme to extend the fiber optic networks, it is said that the fiber cables would go up to the entrance of the village only and not to the home of residents. Well, this may be due to various reasons. Cost is one factor, and that some villages have told me that it costs $20,000 for the lane of fiber cables up to their door, and they find it too expensive. So we support, whilst I support the funding, the subsidy scheme to be submitted to the Finance Committee, I want to emphasize that we have residents in rural areas, and the network coverage is a necessity. Even with the police's Hong Kong SOS app, we still need to work on the remaining villages. There are hundreds of them. Now, let's talk about the fiber to the home initiative. Our operators have made a lot of efforts. Apart from extending the fiber-based networks to the entrance of villages, OFCA has also actively liaised with the rural area committees as well as the district offices. As I understand, 90% of residents can now enjoy fiber to the home arrangement. So we will continue to step up coordination to make sure that more villages will benefit from the subsidy scheme. To take the second question about other villages, we will continue to make an effort to review villages not included in the subsidy scheme. We also welcome suggestions from members and the general public. If there is a need in a particular village and if a structure is available for the installation of the RBS, then we'll be happy to check out that spot and see how we'll take it further. Right, the item will be submitted to the Finance Committee, and I think that many members will remain concerned about the coverage. Can you give us a list of villages? What villages are covered by Phase 1? As you say that it will be extended to 90%. I've received complaints from many villages that they are left outside the scope. And about the extension of fiber-based networks to the villages, can you tell me what villages are left out despite claiming having a 90% coverage? Can you tell us? Can you give us a table so that district councillors will be able to follow up on the situation and that we can take it further from there? It will also serve as reference by the sector about fiber network extension. We've completed 210 villages, and 90% in these villages are able to enjoy fiber to the home arrangements. We'll give you more figures later. Mr. Holden CHOW.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You made a valid point, so I want to ride on that to put my own question. More than 200 villages were covered by the fiber-based network scheme. That scheme is still going on. So now we have this subsidy scheme to cover 20,000 villagers. It's like filling the gap. So we fill the gap from the fiber scheme. When the government shares that table with us, can we also get a sense of which villages will be covered, meaning villages left out from the fiber scheme will be covered by this subsidy scheme? Will we be able to get a sense of what these villages are from the table from the government? We want to make good use of our resources. So I'm wondering if we can cover villages left out previously so that we can make good use of resources. So the fiber scheme covered 238 villages. For this subsidy scheme, about RBSS, we're talking about 70 villages. There's no overlap between the 235 villages under the fiber scheme and the 70 villages under this subsidy scheme. But as I said, we will keep reviewing our schemes. For villages left out by both schemes, if they're further away off the beaten track in terms of the fiber network, we will look at what we can do to help them. There are hundreds of villages, and you're only covering 200 or so villages plus 70. You're not even halfway through, so many villages are left out. Many villages are close to the trunk of the fiber network. In some of those densely populated villages, operators have the financial incentive to put in the infrastructure. So before you submit the proposal to the Finance Committee, can you give us a table showing us which villages will not need your subsidy scheme so that we know where we can save resources? Thank you. So that's the item. The sentiment I get is that most members support this funding proposal. So this proposal will go on to the FC. A declaration of interest. I'm a consultant with China Mobile. Mr. Tony Tse. Thank you, Madam Chair. Before the proposal goes to the FC, I want some further details. What do we mean by complex works? Are we simply talking about construction costs? If the construction cost goes up to $3 million, the government gives full subsidy. Is that the case? Anything to add, Undersecretary? For complex projects, we're talking about 8 million project. The overall cost, $8 million. We need clarity. So if a project falls just short of $8 million, do you treat that as a straightforward project? We consider a few factors in determining whether a project is complicated. So, one, whether extra civil or structural works are needed. And two, whether there is vehicular access, whether helicopters are needed. Madam Chair, if there are many factors, so does it mean that as long as you meet one requirement, people get the $4 billion subsidy? We need more clarity on where you draw the line. We have to consider the proposals to be submitted by the MNOs. If we can see complicated works in the proposal, even if that proposal does not meet all our requirements, we treat that as a complicated project. But if the proposal checks none of the boxes, then that project won't qualify for the $4 million cap. The paper left many things unclear. I'm not happy with the response I just heard. This is a funding proposal. I don't want to get hung up over this point with so much back and forth. I asked how you tell when a project is complicated, but there is no definition. Or does the government simply dictate what counts as complicated? You will have to spell that out clearly when you reach the Finance Committee. So we're done with this item. We move on to item 4. Proposed arrangement of the spectrum auction for the 2.5, 2.6 GHz band and the relevant spectrum utilization fee. Under Secretary, we still have you who will walk us through the paper. Members who wish to speak, please press the button. Madam Chair, this year we will be auctioning spectrum bands. I hope members can support this. To support mobile communication and other communications sustained development in Hong Kong, we have been doing our work to ensure the stable supply of spectrum bands. We looked at overseas experience. From 2019 to 2024, we assigned a total of 3,330 megahertz of spectrum in various bands that can support 5G telecom services. Our telecoms operators have rolled out various forms of 5G services to support the needs of different socio-economic activities. To keep enhancing the speed of Hong Kong's telecom services, we will do another round of auction of 2.5, 2.6 gigahertz spectrum. The current term of assignment will expire in May 2028. The 6 and 2.6 gigahertz is primarily the medium mid-band spectrum. It has range and coverage. Previously, we did a public consultation on frequency bands. The general sentiment was supportive of the auction, so we have looked at the feedback and we are now setting out the arrangements for the auction. And based on under the current mechanisms, the SCED and the OFCA will put out a notice in April this year setting out the spectrum utilization fees and how the frequency bands will be auctioned. In the second quarter this year, we will table the amended subsidiary legislation through a negative vetting mechanism, and that will provide the legal basis for the auctioning and the SUF. Successful bidders will get full tax break for the SUF they pay. That measure was previously put in place to encourage investment in telecoms infrastructure so that better services can be provided. My colleague from OFCA will give us further details about our proposal, and then we will be happy to take questions. Please be brief, Mr. Sidney Zhang. We're here to brief members on auctioning the frequency bands from the 2.5, 2.6 gigahertz band and the SUF. The policy in Hong Kong is to facilitate the most economical and efficient use of spectrum by assigning to those who will make the best use of it to encourage innovation and investment. Market competition will be the way through which we can get operators to provide quality services. We provide suitable frequency bands for operators. As the Undersecretary said, over the past few years, we assigned 3,330 megahertz of frequency bands for 5G services. For mid and low band, we have provided various bands: 700 megahertz, 3.3 gigahertz, 3.5 gigahertz, 4.9 gigahertz, 26, 28 gigahertz. At the high frequency band, we have also provided certain bands. In the fourth quarter last year, for the 800, 900 megahertz and 2.3 gigahertz bands, that's 110 megahertz in total. We reassigned the bands. Now for 6 and 7 gigahertz, we assigned 400 megahertz of frequency bands. The auction was done last November. In the fourth quarter this year, we will be reassigning bands, and that's in the 2.5, 2.6 frequency bands, 500 megahertz in total, and we will be auctioning those bands later this year. Our assessment is that there will be competitive demand for this frequency band. It's now providing 4G services, but this band is also capable of supporting 5G services. There's both coverage and range in this band. Over the past 10 years, mobile data usage has grown persistently. For every person, they use roughly 29 gigabytes per month. We're reassigning frequency bands for a few purposes. First, customer service continuity. Second, efficient spectrum utilization, promotion of effective competition, and encouragement of investment and innovation. With these factors in mind, the Communications Authority does not see any overriding public policy reason to deviate from this market-based approach for reassigning the 2.5, 2.6 gigahertz band. We think from various options, auction is the best option. Now we are auctioning 500 megahertz of band 50. There were 5 bands, each band 10 megahertz. We propose a simultaneous multi-round ascending auction. All interested parties are eligible. They do have to meet requirements about connected bidders. Each successful bidder will get no more than 20 megahertz, or 40% of total. And then in 5 years, the coverage will have to be at least 90% of Hong Kong's population. The successful bidder will also have to lodge a performance bond. There will be 5 frequency bands, each 2 by 5 megahertz. The cap is 20 megahertz per bidder. This will be an auction. Each assignment will be roughly 10 years and 10 months from June 2028 to the end of March 2039. Within 5 years of the reassignment, each bidder will have to cover 90% of Hong Kong's population and services. There will be a performance bond to make sure the bidder performs the service. For incumbent users or assignees of the 2.5, 2.6 gigahertz, they can provide their current network coverage figures to show their service rollout has covered at least 90% of the population. That will be in place of the performance bond. On setting the spectrum utilization fee, since we will be doing an auction, the successful bidder will have to pay their SUF through the payment for the band. Closer to the auction, the SCED will set the reserve price, and we will make sure this will be a competitive process. Assignees can pay the fee either in a lump sum payment or pay by annual installments over 10 years. From the public consultation, we have received 4 submissions from the incumbent mobile network operators. They generally support the reassignment of the spectrum. Certain operators expressed other views as well. Some incumbents wanted priority in reassignment. Others argued the auction should be open only to incumbents. And they also asked for a higher cap for each bidder. Some argued for a 15-year assignment period.
As for the next step, as mentioned by the Undersecretary, we'll consider the views received, we'll consider other factors, and following that, the CDB and CA will issue joint statements in April 2025 to announce the decisions on the arrangements for reassignment of the spectrum and the SUF, and then by negative vetting, we will submit the subsidiary legislation amendment to the Legislative Council for to provide legal backing for the auctioning of the spectrum by the end of this year. The Secretary will also decide the auction reserve price nearer to the time of action. We have 4 members waiting to speak, Mr. Chan Sil-hong, Tony Che, William Wong, and myself. Please also say whether you support this legislative proposal. Mr. Chan Sil-hong, 4 minutes. I understand from the presentation and from the paper that there are no overriding public grounds to depart from the existing practice, and therefore I agree that we should leverage on the market principles and that I support the auction, in other words. Now, I also support the legislative amendments to be submitted. I have a question about 11C in the paper. That's about auction format and eligible bidders. The minimum qualification requirements should be met. I understand that. What about the connected bidder restriction? What is meant by that? There are 4 MNOs in the market, one of which is a joint venture. So can you please explain this point? And then the 4 MNOs expressed their views during the public consultation stage. I see that there is general support for your proposal. Now, but the paper seems to be silent about this. And you didn't mention anything about that in your presentation. Now, the validity period is one of 10 years and 10 months. I understand that new bidders are welcome. But years ago, we did have new market entrants, but because of various reasons, after participating in the auction for the spectrum couldn't be put to use. Now, I understand that there is a performance bond to be paid as a guarantee that there should be at least 90% coverage of the population. I want to know whether by introducing this requirement, you will be able to stop this blunder from happening again. My other point is that according to one of the MNOs, introducing a bidding cap will limit the large players. I understand the intention is to avoid market domineering by any MNO. But your consultation paper also addresses this point by suggesting that the concern can be allayed. So I'd like to know whether this view, you've considered this view. Right, we need to hand over this room by 4:30. I'll draw a line after the administration has given a reply. Thank you, Mr. Chen. As you mentioned, there is a spectrum cap. The proposed spectrum cap can ensure that spectrum can be assigned to not less than 3 MNOs to avoid over dominance by any party. We think that this proposed cap can facilitate market competition. Now, about the performance bond and also the requirement for the assignee to reach a certain percentage of coverage, we want to make sure that spectrum can be utilized by the market in the most efficient manner. I will give the floor to the Director General about the connected bidder restriction. We will require that there is no connection among or between each bidder. Say if a company owns more than 25% of shares of another company, then this company will be banned from bidding for the spectrum. So we will remind the 4 participating MNOs of this requirement. As for new market players, after winning the auction, the spectrum in the end was not put to use. I want to clarify that indeed we had some new bidders in the past, but because of the actual circumstances, there were changes to the plan. For example, in the end, they were able to fulfill the requirements. We did not confiscate the performance bond. They were able to meet our requirements, in other words. Now, be it incumbent or new operators, we will remind them to observe our requirements strictly. About the connecting bidder restriction, paragraph 5 refers to GBL, which is a joint venture between Hong Kong T and Hutchison. It's a 50-50 joint venture. Does it mean that only either Hong Kong T or Hutchison could participate in the auction? True, if GBL is to take part in the bidding process, then neither HKT nor Hutchison could participate. Does it mean that you want to avoid any MNO taking up too much of the spectrum? Well, you introduce a spectrum cap so that and that if you have more than one entity or having a subsidiary company, you will be able to get more of the spectrum. To ensure a level playing field and in line with the confidentiality principle, we have introduced this connected bidder restriction. Mr. Tony Chair, I support this proposal, but I do have some questions. Assignment period. As I understand, for this round, instead of a standard period of 15 years, it's shorter now. Can you just briefly explain why? Why is it that with a shorter assignment period, the CA will have greater flexibility to carry out spectrum planning and enhance efficiency with regard to new developments in the future? Let's go to the PowerPoint. During the consultation, 4 MNOs expressed their views. Can you explain why their views were not taken on board apart from the assignment period? And then there is this requirement that within the 5-year period, the coverage should go up to 90% of the population. Well, the validity period is more than 10 years. So do you impose a deadline? In other words, about coverage. Right, thank you, member, for the question. First of all, why aren't we adopting an assignment period of 15 years? Now, altogether, we have 140 megahertz for the 2.5 and 2.6 gigahertz, and 90 megahertz were put up in auction earlier. So we are talking about the remaining 50 megahertz. Well, if we go by the 15-year assignment period, that means it won't expire until 2043. For the remaining 90 megahertz, they will expire in 2038. That means if we don't adjust the assignment period on this occasion, things will become or remain fragmented. As mentioned by the honourable member, we want to give greater flexibility to the authority to catch up with the technological developments in terms of spectrum planning in the future, so as to further enhance the efficiency of spectrum utilization. And to answer Mr. Tony Chia's question, the MNOs have expressed diverse views. I've covered the point about assignment period as well as the spectrum cap. There is a view as to whether incumbent assignees should enjoy priority in the assignment of certain spectrum, as well as limiting participation in auction to existing MNOs. Now let me address the first issue, that is priority for incumbent assignees. Under the principle of a level playing field and promoting competition, we don't think that any spectrum assignee should enjoy automatic right of renewal or first right of refusal, because as mentioned by my colleagues, we don't see any overriding public policy reasons to depart from the existing market-based model. And that means we should not allow for a right of first refusal by incumbent assignees. But you do consider continuity of service provision, is that right? That is why, quite 3 years before expiry of the current assignment period, we start this exercise so that there won't be any service disruption. There will not be any impact on incumbent operators. As mentioned just now about allowing existing MNOs to take part in the spectrum auction only, like the Director General said, as long as the bidding requirements are met, from the perspective of promoting competition, we should not limit participation to existing MNOs only, but all players. Coverage, please. It is true that we set the minimum coverage rate, and that's 90%. OFCA will continue to monitor coverage as well as serve the services as per the undertaking. Of course, a follow-up action will be taken if they fail to meet the requirements. On the last point, over 90% coverage, there is no time limit on when this requirement is to be met. Well, this is the minimum coverage proposed. I'll give the floor to DG. Well, this is the statutory requirement. The performance bond will be forfeited if the requirement is not met. So that's the consequence. It's a breach of the licensing condition. So at least the coverage should be 90%. Meanwhile, we do require the operator to provide quality service as per the license condition. So in the face of a complaint, we may require them to do more. We can't, however, put down 100% as the minimum because of the distribution of population in Hong Kong and the terrain. We therefore decide that 90% is the minimum, and then we also invoked other measures to handle complaints and address blind spots. We find the approach reasonable. Right, Madam Chair, I think many members spoke on coverage in the last discussion item. 10% of the population is a big number, so the administration should go back and consider raising the requirement. I know that 100% as a minimum is impossible, but 90% is a figure that you have stuck to for a long time. Maybe there is room to raise the percentage?
Now it's my turn. I make a declaration. I'm a consultant with China Mobile. I want to write on Mr. Tony Chia's question At the last item, we discussed coverage. We wanted businesses to step up to the plate. So we wonder if we can raise the coverage rate from 90% to somewhere higher. That's for the government to consider. Now, for large events venues and express rail terminals, people complain about the slow 5G service or even problems with accessing the service, and that affect travelers' experience. So do we have plans to improve the 5G service in terms of the capacity at those venues? Telecoms operators are discussing 5.5G and 6G as well as low altitude economy, apart from auctioning spectrum bands. So have we considered the need for 5.5G, 6G, and the low altitude economy for the future? Madam Chair, for large public events venues, we have been coordinating with operators to enhance the 5G capacity. At the Convention and Exhibition Center, Asia World Expo, City Hall, Victoria Park, and the Kai-Tak Sports Park, and Hong Kong Coliseum, we have put in place either RBSs or other forms of infrastructure to enhance the capacity and network coverage. So we will continue to coordinate the effort. When there's a major event, we will see if the conditions nearby are suitable for a 5G RBS. We will get in touch with the operators to make sure we get good coverage during the event. The member also mentioned the low altitude economy, 5.5G and 6G. As far as we know, 6G will start to become popular in 2030. We have done much advanced preparatory work. For 6 and 7 gigahertz, Hong Kong is among the first economies to auction bands in the 6 and 7 gigahertz area. The bands we have auctioned in recent years work not just for 5G but also for 6G. And we will keep working on the preparations for 6G. For 5.5G, many major events have taken place. Operators of telecoms have adopted the 5G or 5.5G model in promoting those events. So on that note, we encourage our telecoms operators to commit more resources into the infrastructure for 5G and 5.5G to provide better services to the public. And on low altitude economy, do we have any plans in terms of the infrastructure for a low altitude economy? The Deputy Financial Secretary reported on work on this front at the panel on economic development. CDB and OFCA will provide support in terms of spectrum bands. The low altitude economy covers many areas, spectrum bands being one of them. The Deputy Financial Secretary and the Transport and Logistics Bureau will make further announcements on relevant measures at an appropriate time. Dr. Junius Ho, I drew the line, but we have time left, so I will give you 3 minutes, questions and answer inclusive. Thank you. I don't know much about this topic, so I want to find out more. So, how much in terms of revenue are we expecting from this auction? A rough estimate will do. So you have a reserve price, maybe 10, $15 billion. So how much revenue are we expecting from this auction? Have we looked at the figures? Director General, let's look at the previous auction. For the 2.5, 2.6 gigahertz, there was brilliant auction 2021. 114 megahertz in total. We auctioned 90 megahertz. We're now focusing on the remaining 50 megahertz. Last time, the reserve price was $450 million. The result was $860 million. So applying that yardstick, we can expect maybe $480 million. It will depend on the competition at the time and the reserve price. So that's purely for reference. Now my second question. At the previous item, we discussed 5G. We got good coverage, but we have to constantly seek to do better. And at the last item, the government was looking for another $150 million for 50 RBSs, each at $200,000 to $400,000, altogether $150 million. The goal for coverage is only 90%. At the last item, 5G coverage targeted at 90%. So at the last item, the government wanted $150 million. We wanted to boost our coverage further from 90 to 98%. So for the spectrum auction, we still have 10% to cover. Would that mean the successful bidders will need further government subsidies to boost the coverage further? In this upcoming auction, can we require the successful bidders to enhance the coverage, obviating the need for future government subsidies? And we're talking about two separate matters. In urban centers, crowded places, the coverage is at 98% or above. So we're doing well there. At the last item, you said 99% in central business district, MTR stations, 98 such stations. I get it. In core urban areas, the coverage is very high. But at the last item, we heard that the rural areas need to be covered. For the 20,000 villagers, we want to cover them. So the same principle applies here. Will the same problem occur? The Madam Chair also mentioned the low altitude economy. Maybe we will need spectrum for drones. A drone without coverage may just fall off and then hurt people. So I have safety concerns for drones. So has the government given thought to this? Director General, we have duly considered these factors. 5G services hinge on not just spectrum. Now for a 5G service to work, you need many spectrum bands. We're only auctioning a small part of the auction. We're reassigning a small portion of the spectrum. And that may be able to bring us hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. Altogether, the spectrum auctions over the years have brought in more than $10 billion in revenue. We ask operators to keep going. Once they hit the 90% coverage rate, they get to keep the performance bond, but they have to meet their licensing conditions, and that is providing services that are satisfactory to the communications authority. When we get complaints or when a problem comes up, we will ask operators to install more RBSs. At major events, venues, when the service is poor, we will ask operators to provide more RBSs to offer better services. So this is ongoing work. Thank you. One more comment. This is for the Bureau to consider. We have this trump card. If we had this trump card, we wouldn't have to provide $150 million for operators to fill the gap, to fix the problems. We granted the licenses, we left something out, so we had to get the operators to fix the problem. So that's why we're asking for $150 million in subsidies. So now, since we are looking at a new auction exercise, can we learn from the mistake from the last item so that we don't make the same mistake? Members have made themselves clear. Members believe we need a higher goal in terms of coverage at the upcoming auction so that more people living in rural areas can access high-speed internet. The message is clear. Please consider that. Members will probably raise those points again at the Finance Committee. Now, near boundary control points and the high-speed rail terminus, the government said it would ask the operators to step up service, but we have indeed received many complaints. The government requests operators to do the work, but when will these operators do as they're told? They may be dragging their feet or they fall short of the target. So can we make these things part of the licensing conditions? At boundary control points and terminals, we need coverage. Once we get a complaint, we work with the operators on how to improve network coverage. But we have to consider the practicalities. At the high-speed rail terminus or MTR stations, there are constraints in terms of the maintenance hours. The operators have to compete with other utilities providers for the few hours of window for repair. For major venues, we need the permission from the management companies of these venues before we can repair or upgrade the facilities. We'll have to talk to those operators so that our works can get a higher priority. I think we've made the point clear. Most members support this proposal. So that's it for this item. Fifth item, any other business? There being no other business, I adjourn the meeting here. Thank you. 多謝主席。